Hey, hey, cats and kittens, it's Doc Hammond, and I'm going to tell you a story. I had a little trouble deciding what story to tell today, so I brought my friend Burwell, the gray squirrel, in with me here, and I thought maybe I'd ask him if he had any suggestions. Burwell, what do you think? What kind of story should I tell? Oh, yeah, I like that idea. He says he thinks that I should tell a story about his brother, Stumpy the squirrel. Now, I've told some stories about Stumpy before, so I hope that might be fun for you too. But Burwell, is there a particular story that you'd like me to tell today? Okay, yeah, I think I can do that. So, what Burwell says is that he would like for me to tell the story of Stumpy and the bear. And I suspect that one of the reasons he wants me to tell that story is that his brother Stumpy comes off in a pretty heroic light in this story. Well, I'm gonna let him sit on the couch next to me here, so I'll set Burwell down there. Now, some of you might remember that Stumpy the squirrel lives out at Kibbe Pond in Townsend with his buddy Walt Walthers. Now, Walt's an older fella, and he has a cozy cabin out there on the pond with a nice dock with a boat named Nellie that he takes out pretty much every day, and Stumpy rides with him in the boat. Now, uh, Walt's lived out there with Stumpy for a number of years, but recently a young woman named Amy Rigetti and her son Tony have moved in to a house down the road that used to be abandoned. So uh, Walt has and Stumpy have become very close friends with Amy and Tony. And this is a story that's going to involve Tony in particular as well. Because one day in the summer, Walt invited Tony to come with him for a walk in the woods to pick blueberries. And it was right at the height of blueberry season. And Walt thought that this was something that Tony might enjoy. And he knew that Stumpy would be more than happy to go along with him. Stumpy, by the way, in case you didn't know this before, Stumpy had an accident a while ago and he lost most of his tail. So he has only a stub of a tail about an inch long. But it doesn't slow him down any at all. He still runs like crazy through the forest, up and down the trees, out across the branches. He loves to go out in Nellie the boat, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago. And so he is about as active and healthy as anybody could be. Well, Walt made the arrangement with Amy to bring Tony up to the house and drop him off on her way to work. She works at a beauty parlor in the next town over. It's called Air Hair, which is kind of a clever name, I think, for a beauty parlor. But anyway, Amy brought Tony along, and as soon as he opened the door and jumped out, Tony was just so excited. He said, "Mr. Walt, Mr. Walt," that's what he calls Walt. "Mr. Walt, can Stumpy and I go down to the dock and feed the bluegills?" Because, of course, Walt had some time ago shown Stumpy the bluegill sunfish that live all around his dock and that like to eat bits of bread that Walt and his guests will bring down for them to sample. So Walt said, "Yeah, well, that'd be fine. Just make sure you say goodbye to your mom before we go down there." So Tony gave his mom a hug, and he said, "Come on, Stumpy, let's go." And Stumpy and Tony went down to the dock while Walt went in the house and grabbed a piece of bread so they could feed the fish. After that, they had a little snack. Walt had made some peanut butter chocolate chip muffins. And so they had some apple juice and muffins up in the house, up in the cabin. And along with that, of course, Stumpy got a little bite of muffin, but Walt also gave him some of his favorite honey roasted cashews. After that, Walt got out a backpack he had, and he got it ready for their hike in the woods. And in the bag, he put some stuff for snacks. He had a couple of apples, and he had some graham crackers, and of course, he had a few more uh, honey roasted cashews for Stumpy in case he got hungry. He had a couple of juice boxes, and in addition to that, he packed some plastic margarine containers with covers and a plastic bucket, the kind of bucket that you might use if you go to the beach to dig in the sand. The plastic margarine containers were for him to pick blueberries into, and the bucket was for Tony to use because it was just about the right size and it had a handle. Well, they set off into the woods, and this was along a path out under the pine trees and out under the oaks and the maples of the deeper forest. And it was a path that Walt and Stumpy go for a walk on almost every day, so they know it pretty well. And along the way, as they walked along, Walt would pause to show Tony some of the things that he wanted him to notice, some of the natural elements, including wildflowers, mushrooms. He even found a garter snake and held that so that Tony could touch it and see that snakes aren't slimy at all. They just have a lovely, smooth, leathery skin. And of course, he also spotted a few of his favorite friends, the red efts, the little salamanders that stand along the path in different places, almost as if they were guarding it for the queen of the forest. Well, while they were doing that, Stumpy was busy too. He would tear up and down the path. He'd get way out ahead of him. Then he'd come rushing back and zoom right by him. And then he'd turn around and he'd zoom back and he'd climb up a tree and he'd go out on a branch and he'd chatter and go ch-ch-ch-ch-ch. And then he'd come down again and he'd just keep doing this. And Walt said, you know, Tony, sure looks like old Stumpy's got a skeeter in his scooter today. And that reminds me, one of the other things that Walt packed was bug spray, because the mosquitoes around Kibbe Pond are fierce. Not only will they take chunks out of your skin, but sometimes they'll actually carry people off as if they were a special order of Chinese food or something. So anyway, they'd had some sprayed bug spray put on them to help keep them safe from those pretty monstrous and vicious mosquitoes. Well, they walked along until they finally came to one of the first big bushes. And there Walt gave Tony some picking instructions. He said, Tony, the important thing about picking blueberries is that you can't really go wrong. But the best ones to pick are either blue, dark purple, or even black. That means they're fully ripe. If you see ones that are white or green or red, you probably would do better not to pick them. But even those will ripen up if you leave them sitting on the kitchen counter for a day or so. So you can't go wrong in picking. And by the way, one of the other fun things about picking blueberries is you can eat as many as you want while you're picking. And I suspect that you'll enjoy doing that. I know that's the part of it that Stumpy enjoys in particular. Well, they stopped at that one bush and they did some picking there and they continued on their way. And Stumpy continued to be just full of energy, tearing up and down the path, climbing trees, chattering at them, dashing back down. And you'd think eventually he might wear himself out. Well, by the time they got to the biggest bush, Walt's favorite to pick at, Stumpy did seem to be slowing down a little bit. He went up the tree that hangs over that bush and he went out on the big limb and he kind of plunked down there and just settled in. And Walt was pretty sure that he would doze off and have a little nap after a while. In the meantime, Walt explained to Tony some of the procedure for picking blueberries. He said, here's what we're going to do. Let's do it as a team, okay? I'll pick the high ones and you pick the low ones. And that way we can both handle the ones that we can reach, and we'll get as many of the good ripe ones as we possibly can. So Tony agreed, and they set about picking. And while they picked, Walt talked to Tony, and he told Tony why he loves picking blueberries so much. Among other things, he said, Tony, you know, one of the best things about blueberries is you don't have to do any work to help them grow. You just wait until they're ripe, and then you go out and you pick them. And it's like getting free gifts from the universe. So I've always liked that about picking blueberries. And Walt continued talking to Tony. He could occasionally hear the plunk of a blueberry going into Tony's pail, but he didn't hear that plunk as often as he might have because, as he had expected, Tony was eating a lot of those blueberries. Well, after a while, Walt realized that even though he'd continued talking, he hadn't heard Tony for a minute or two. And so he decided he'd just call out and see where Tony was. So he said, Tony! And when he said that, a strange thing happened. From his left side, he heard Tony say, "What, Mr. Walt?" And from his right side, he heard something else. He heard a sound sort of like this. "Ooh!" And then he looked over the blueberry bush, and there, 15 feet away from him, was a black bear. And that black bear had had the same idea, to go out and pick some blueberries, and instead of putting them into a bucket or a margarine container, he was stuffing them all in his mouth. But when Walt had yelled, that bear had stopped, and he was looking right at Walt. And Walt said, "Tony, come right back over where we were standing together a minute or two ago, and be very quiet. Don't be afraid if I start making a lot of noise." Because Walt knew that if you run into a bear in the woods, you do two things. One is you try to make yourself look as big as possible, and the other is you make as much noise as possible in hopes that it will scare the bear off. Well, Tony came close, and Walt was just about to reach up and spread his arms out to make himself look as big as possible, when from the tree limb over the blueberry bush, he saw a gray and white blur of fur jump down onto the top of the bear's head, and then immediately launch itself back up and land on the branch. Well, that bear spun around to see what it was that was attacking him, but he couldn't see anything at all. And he turned back and looked at Walt again, and then Stumpy jumped down again, and this time he ran in place on top of the bear's head, and then he jumped up to the branch overhead again, and the bear spun around a second time. And he turned back and he looked at Walt once more, and that was when Stumpy jumped down a third time. And that time, when he jumped back up to the branch, Walt could have sworn he actually turned a somersault before he landed. Well, that bear, by that point, had decided that he'd had enough of this invisible attacker. And so he turned and he made his way out of the woods as fast as he could. And if you think that Stumpy's feet made some noise as he thundered up and down the path earlier, well, you should have heard the noise that bear's feet made as he ran away. Well, Tony, at this point, looked up at Walt and said, "Mr. Walt, was that a bear?" And Walt said, "Yes, Tony, it was. It was a black bear." And Tony said, "Mr. Walt, do you suppose you could call it back? I didn't get a very good look at it." And Walt just laughed, and he said, "Well, Tony, I'd probably rather not call the bear back anyway, but I'm pretty sure he wouldn't come, because you're not going to want to tangle twice with Stumpy, the backwoods bear bouncer." Walt decided that maybe after that incident it was time for him to get Tony home. And he was a little bit worried about what Tony's mom, Amy, would say when she got home and heard the story about this. But, in fact, Amy was very appreciative of Stumpy's efforts, and she brought him a package of honey roasted cashews as a special treat for him and a thank you for protecting Walt and especially Tony from that bear. Now, Walt was afraid that Amy wouldn't let him take Tony blueberry picking anymore. But in fact, what Amy said was she'd rather he not take him out into bear territory. But if he wanted to, he could take Tony out picking blueberries in Nellie the boat, which is, of course, one of Walt's favorite things to do, to take Nellie around to the islands out in the middle of the pond where the blueberries grew very thickly, and along the shoreline, the main shoreline of the pond too. And so Walt and Tony and Amy and Stumpy made a date to go out fishing for blueberries on Nellie the boat a couple of days later.